immenso di introdurre l'ultimo ospite di queste 2 giornate, Richard Sennet, un ospite che probabilmente non ha bisogno di particolari introduzioni, quindi sarò molto sintetico. Richard Sennet ha studiato relazioni sociali ad Harvard, lavorando con David Riesman e con Hannah Arendt. Ha fondato il New York Institute for the Humanities, ha insegnato alla New York University, alla London School of Economics ed è stato presidente dell'American Council on Work. E negli ultimi circa, direi, 5 decenni ha scritto e ricercato moltissimo sui rapporti sociali nelle città e sul rapporto tra i cambiamenti nella sfera del lavoro e le teorie sociali. Molti di noi probabilmente hanno letto alcuni dei suoi libri, come The Hidden Injuries of Class, The Fall of Public Man, The Corrosion of Character, The Culture of the New Capitalism, The Craftsman e Building and Dwelling. Quindi lascerei il palco a Richard Sennet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. When Stefano called me about this project, I had an idea, which was that some work that Ricky Burdett, Saskia Sassen, and I did for the United Nations a few years ago might be useful to you as a way of thinking about the project that you are embarking on here in Rome. And basically, we were asked by people who were very unhappy about the way in which funds from the World Bank, the IMF, and so on were flowing into Latin America and Africa. We're unhappy about the results of urbanistically of the projects that were being built. And after a long series of discussions with various people, we developed something called the Quito Papers, because it was presented in Quito, Ecuador, and about ideas about closed and open cities. And I try and explain a little about what we were thinking, and not that we were right or wrong, but that it might be stimulating to you about thinking about how to open up the city in a context which is not that of the problems of post-colonialism and dependency that afflict people in the global South. They, like everyone, wanted to live in cities which are clean and safe, have efficient public services, be supported by a dynamic economy, provide cultural stimulation, and also do their best to heal divisions of race, class, and ethnicity. And of course, those are not the cities they live in. Mostly, those cities fail locally because they're not in control of themselves. Most cities in the global South are not their own masters. And still, something has gone wrong, radically wrong, I think, in our conception of what a city itself should be. We need to imagine how to get all of these virtues as something which is open to all citizens, rather than something which is a closed ideal. In saying this, I'm propounding a paradox, because today's planner has technological tools from lighting to bridging and tunneling to materials for buildings, which urbanists 100 years ago could not even begin to imagine. We have many more resources than in the past, but these resources aren't used very creatively. There is a political side to the fact of that creation, which is to that lack of creation, which is that the closed city is basically the product of hegemonic rule and neo-capitalist, as it passes in the third world, development. But what I want to focus on tonight is there's also another complicit partner in this, and that's us, which is that the lack of imagination about how to make urban life more open feeds in to the hegemonic practices of global capital and nationalist control. If you think about, I just explained this off the text. I mean, if you think about Corbusier's Plan Voisin, this is a control freak's absolute nightmare vision of the closed city. The street is destroyed, so there's no noise. As we've seen, it's a kind of anti-biological paradise, so we thought. But in terms of closure, it's got some features which apply particularly to built form. One is that all the forms are standardized. You know that these 18-story hexagonal towers. And Corbusier's notion was that they could, it originally was designed for the Marais in Paris, which he wanted to destroy, but that it could be extended infinitely, that you had a combination of homogeneity and boundarylessness, which meant that the city could be controlled as a whole. And that's the kind of thing, unfortunately, I worked for the UN for now 12 years. I just retired, thank God. But I worked, the 12 years I was in the UN, those were the kinds of projects they favored. Projects which were replicable and problems which could be extended throughout the city, so that you had a type form which would serve the whole city. What's behind this, I think, in terms of systems theory about closed form are two things. One is the notion that the city should be in equilibrium. That is, that it should, all the parts in the city should interact with each other so that the city is, as we would say now falsely, that it's sustainable. As when we think about bad examples of high-tech cities like Songdo in outside of Seoul, that the notion is that everything is in balance. To do that, you need to have some overarching principle of control which regulates everything. And secondly, the principle of a closed architecture for a city is that things are integrated. That is, that every part of the system has a place in an overall design. Again, today, that's bad planning in AI terms, is that there is that kind of integration of the system. What you're eliminating is conflict, ambiguity, and a kind of irresolution of cities in time, which is the most important thing about this. That is, that this kind of Corbusian planning, which became the model for what we did in the, not we, but the UN did with a lot of its investments in the global south, was that you had an environment when, from the moment that the papers were solved out, were signed off, that the city itself was fixed in form. Time and the deformations of time were the kind of enemy of development. That is, that time was, if you make a plan which is coordinated and which is in equilibrium, you have a static form. And that's what I think, and I'm putting these are fancy words in the mouths of people who were complaining to us, what was killing their cities by development, that they had no open-ended history. Now, it was argued to us that the social contrast to a closed system would be the free market, and that's not right, you know, the market that fluctuates. And that opposition is in fact not what it seems. The cunning of neoliberalism is in general, and of Reaganism and Thatcherism, which set the course for the UN, was to speak the language of freedom while manipulating closed bureaucratic systems for private gain by an elite. That's a great danger we faced. And equally, in my experience as a planner, these developments in London as in New York, developers who complain most loudly about zoning restrictions are all adept at using these rules at the expense of communities. So what I want to describe, this is a very long preamble to saying what I want to describe to you tonight, which is an open system. It lies in a different kind of social system, not in brute private enterprise, which is easily corruptible. A social system which is open rather than closed, and a social system which is reflected in its physical urbanism. I should say that the idea of an open system traces back to Norbert Wiener, and it's a notion essentially about the nonlinear character of time, that it's path-dependent instead. And he was interested in how these path dependencies would, at the end of his life, he was a very complicated character who worked at MIT. At the end of his life, he realized that what he had been trying to do was sort of wrong. He developed a lot of the mathematical thinking about path dependency, you know, where you go from here and then you could go here or up there. And this is the essence of a nonlinear system, that it just doesn't go like this. But he realized at the end of his life that these path dependencies, when they're translated into social terms, mean that societies are inherently, when they're open, are in conflict, that there is no resolution. And that's a very difficult proposition. It's a difficult proposition in thinking about social life. It's equally difficult for us as architects and planners to think about what to do about that. The one model for that, of course, was Jane Jacobs, my sometime friend. But she was really quite, if we read her now, she was quite conservative figure in some ways. The idea of eyes on the street, for instance, is a panoptic view, you know? It's a way of controlling your neighbors. And if we want an open system, what we want is something that releases people from surveillance. Also, the notion of low scale, which she was obsessive about, meant that cities were pretty much condemned to be places where factories weren't located, where offices weren't located. They were kind of residential, not suburbs, but they were kind of residential communities at the edge of the economic life of cities. So we need something else. And in my own thinking, I have wondered what that something else is, and particularly whether the notion of a life which is open to conflict and open to irregularity and the unknown is something that architects might help design. It's a question of which designs might abet social relationships which endure just because they can evolve and mutate. The visual structuring of evolutionary time is a systematic property of the open city. To make this statement more concrete, I'd like to describe three systematic elements of an open city. One is passage territories, which has to do about walls and membranes. The second is incomplete form, and the third is development narratives. And this is what I've come up with as kind of overview of how you, because I won't live to do it, but how you are going to make an open city out of Rome. We ought to think about these passage territories in terms of the whole, let me put it this way. I'd like to describe in some detail the experience of passing through different territories in the city, both because that active passage is how we know the city as a whole, and also because planners and architects have such difficulties in designing the experience of passage from place to place. I'll start with walls, which seem to be structures inhibiting passage, and then explore some of the ways in which edges of urban territories function like more living walls. Historically, a wall was a container, but it was also a place for the dispossessed. Against the walls is where people who had no right to live in the city clustered. It's also where Jews, Roma, this is before the 19th century, also dwelled. It was also a zone of a place where there was illicit or semi-illicit traffic in goods, which were not taxed. In other words, these are spaces which would have attracted people who lived in a more open way than people who at this edge, this walled edge, than who inhabited legally the center of the city. These walls function architecturally like cell membranes. That is, they were both porous and resistant. You can make a distinction, as I've written about in my book, about the difference between the membrane and the cell wall. Membrane much more porous, letting some things, keeping valuable nutrients in, absorbing nutrients to the outside. The cell wall, much more of a rigid container. And in the history of urbanism, that the walls tended to work, they look solid, but they worked like membranes. And this dual function of the membrane, that it keeps valuable things in some ways, but it also allows a kind of traffic with the illicit outside world, or with the unknown or unregulated outside world, is, I believe, an important principle for visualizing more modern living urban forms. Whenever we construct a barrier, we have equally to make the barrier porous. The distinction between the inside and the outside has to be breachable. That is, that a wall is an ambiguous container. I'll give you an example of a couple of examples of this. If you're designing a highway, you're having to build a wall rather than a membrane. That is, you can't put people, as was true in a lot of the cities we worked with in the UN, you can't put people close up to a 4-lane highway. And what that began to be was that the highways were used as walls between richer and poorer people. So in the bad old days of planning in the UN in the 90s, they'd finance highways which essentially cut off the rich from the poor, because you couldn't transcend these. A more open way of doing this is to have a highway which works which has lots of T-junctions, lots of traffic lights, lots of roundels, for people to come in and out. But it's less efficient, it's less speedy. So that in terms of a wall, one of the aspects of it is the more porous you make it, the more open, the more unisolating, the slower is the speed at which people can move through the city. And it's a very important issue in planning. You have to give up efficient movement in order to open the city to different groups. You could make the same argument about the use of materials like plate glass in an individual building on the ground plane, where you again have a kind of, you see everything inside, but you hear nothing, and usually those plate glass walls are meant to have only one or two entrances, like this one here in this building, so that in fact they're guarded spaces. They're visually open, but they're socially closed. And we were also financing buildings like that in places like Rio and in Accra, in the name of safety, which was a false argument, because those buildings were not invaded by robbers, at least the kinds of robbers they were worried about. Other kinds of robbers were very safe in them. But you understand the principle of this, that in order to have, with the use of a material for construction in the same way that we try to, in the construction of a zone of mobility, that the more ambiguous you make a building about how you get in, where it's controlled and so on, the more open you make it, the more defined entrances and exits, just like highway planning. If it's all rigid, it's all exclusionary. And so one of the things we tried to do in Accra in 2010s was to try and build tall buildings. It's inventing the obvious, which had sort of looked on the ground floors like New York City, with all those small shops. The buildings were very easy to penetrate. There was very little crime in them. Lots of people in the buildings all the time. But it was against the logic of a sealed glass tower, which is the essence of a closed structure. So I'd say to you, in thinking about what you're going to do in this project, is to find more and more ways of, if you like, disaggregating the notion of spatial movement and of being in place. So that many things are happening to it. It's a problem. it's a problem that Louis Sullivan, the 19th century American architect, saw right at the beginning. And it's really interesting about the skyscrapers he made. They've got steel and, cast iron and framed glass panels. But the panels, many of them can be just turned on a pivot. The building is completely porous, if you want it to be. And inside the ground plane is a hive of economic activities, usually going up to the second or the third stories. This is a way of creating a kind of open system. You're doing it systematically. But what will happen in that space is not predetermined by the fact of the way you've organized movement in and outside of it. So that's partially what the kind of experiment I hope you'll do in working on this project in Rome. I want to say something a little more about borders. Ecologists like Stephen Gould have drawn our attention to an important distinction of the natural world, that is between boundaries and borders. But it's a distinction he makes between the membrane or the border, which has lots of biological life, and the boundary in which things come to an end. A border works for Gould as in the ocean between layers of water, or where the water meets the shore. That's intense biological activity happens there. Animals feed off of each other. Evolution seems to speed up. Whereas if you look at a boundary in the natural world, it would be like a tiger establishing his territory or her territory by pooping, which other tigers, once they smell that, they know, no, I'm not going there. And that's an important issue for us, because it's at that kind of edge in which life becomes more intense. And the reason I bring that up is because it affects, since you gave me this title, the meaning of what we think of as community. Our notion is to tend to think of the center of a community as the place where life is most intense for people. But if we follow this clue from Stephen Gould, there should be certain kinds of borders where life is more intense when we interact with other people than if we can make borders of that kind, then will be true in the center. And I'll give you an example of that from my own planning practice. This is when I worked on the Planning Commission of New York City. Some years ago, I was involved in plans for creating a market to serve the Hispanic community of Spanish Harlem in New York. The community, one of the poorest in the city, lies above 96th Street on Manhattan's Upper East Side. But just below 96th is an abrupt shift. And that's one of the richest communities in the world, running from Fifth Avenue down to 59th Street. 96th Street could itself have functioned either as a boundary or a border. We planners, this is our error a long time ago, chose to locate La Marqueta in the center of the Spanish Harlem community, 20 blocks away, and to regard 96th Street as a dead edge. And we did so, we chose wrongly. Had we located the market on that street, we might have encouraged activity which brought the rich and the poor together into some daily commercial contact. that is standing in, just in line to buy. You're either a maid or the lady in the mink coat who employs the maid, and you both need milk. It's 11 o'clock at night, something like that. The reason I bring this up to you is because the intensity of something like this is not a matter of exchange. It's a matter of physical presence. And often when I hear people talking about, bridging differences between communities, what they're thinking about is kind of verbal, agreements, the kind of bien passant a notion of we're all one planet, all of that kind of junk. But they do it from a physical remove. And what I know about this Gould distinction is that in cities, it's as true as it is in the natural world, that physical presence is more important for creating a border than kind of legalistic or verbal kinds of exchanges. And that's the reason why we want to mix functions at the edge between communities so that people are physically drawn into the same space. That's what you want to do, I think. Rather than find some kind of well-meaning, we're all part of one family and we should understand each other, none of us is racists. Forget all that. The notion is that you want, just as we should have done in 96th Street 30 years ago, you want to have that lady in mink and her maid standing in the same line. That's how you get, I think, the kind of stimulation in the city which opens it up. Now, this is a big issue for me. The reason why I should have become an architect rather than a planner is that it really seems to me that physical presence is more important than verbal constructs. That is, that architecture in a way is a much more political activity than government in that sense, and political in the sense of creating an open system. And I know this also from my work in the global South, that when you can bring people of different races just to spend time in the same space together, that you are doing more, this was true in South Africa, you are doing more for racial relations than any kind of governmental activity. And it's that creating that kind of zone which I think is something that architecture can uniquely do to open up the city. Now, the second thing I'd like to talk about, I'm very, very long-winded, is incomplete form. The discussion of walls and borders leads logically to a second systematic characteristic of the open city. That is incomplete form. That is the non-linear kind of form which can be in process and evolve over the course of time. The designer needs to create physical forms of a particular sort which enable incompleteness in a special way. When we design a street, for instance, so that the buildings are set back from a street wall, the space left open in front is not truly public space. Instead, the building has been withdrawn from the street, famous setbacks in New York, which are empty zones largely. We know the practical consequences. People walking on the street tend to avoid these recessed spaces. It's better planning if the building is brought forward into the context of other buildings. And that will change how the building itself works. if it begins to interact with other buildings, its form on the ground plane will begin to evolve. I mean, this may seem simple to you. You create something which is a street wall that creates more kind of intense activity, and the intense activity tends to change the nature of the business that's conducted on the street. We saw an example of this in Bangkok, where we were building 40 years ago. We were building these buildings recessed behind away from the street wall and away from each other. And we did put in ground economic and social activities in the ground, but it was a failure. What we had to do was make it dense. We had to make everything uptight, almost confrontational, you could say. And the result of that kind of pressure and density opened up the form of these buildings, which are now don't look anything like they looked when they were initially designed. Now, I know there are lots of practical constraints against this. It's again, that people want to know what they're paying for and so on. But again, it's an architectural problem. How can you build a form which can be transformed within itself, which allows evolution to occur? Even doing something as setting back a building is a way of prohibiting that kind of evolution, because you remove it from the kind of interaction and complexity at the border, which makes for change. But I think it's a general problem in what we both teach students and what we practice, that we're developing, we don't have a set of notions of how to build which allows for the building itself to take over in time and evolve. It's a very interesting problem. I live now in London. It's a very interesting problem in London. The forms that work well in this way are 18th century Georgian boxes. You can do almost anything with them. And if you look into the history of modern London, the parts of it that have stayed most alive are with these really simple, they're just shoeboxes, basically. You do anything with them. But the buildings that are particularly designed with one use in mind, like schools or hospital clinics, there was a language developed of making these complete forms at the very beginning, and they've decayed in the city. They don't interact with what's around them. And as the uses change in the buildings themselves are become uninhabitable, which has happened with a lot of hospitals, for instance, in London. So this is a question of form, now I know that incomplete form it's a kind of creative credo. In the plastic arts, it's conveyed in sculpture, which is purposely left unfinished. In poetry, it's conveyed in, to use Wallace Stevens' phrase, the engineering of the fragment. And in my generation, the architect Peter Eisenman sought to evoke something similar of the same credo in his term light architecture, meaning an architecture planned so that it can be added to, or more importantly, revised over the course of time as the needs of habitation change. This credo opposes the simple idea of replacement of form, which characterizes cities which are closed. That is, when the form no longer works, the building is destroyed. It doesn't evolve. I'd like finally, as I said, very long-winded, to talk about narratives of development, what they relate to with democratic space. We want to focus on the stages in which a particular project evolves. That is, we want to design them so that we leave ourselves room at each moment of that past dependency to revise and do things new. We need to understand what happens first, and rather than a lockstep towards progression, figure out what can be changed once you do the first things. Now, there's a literary, that's what a narrative development is. There's a literary parallel to this. Imagine, for instance, if a novelist were to announce at the beginning of a story, here's what will happen, what the characters will become, and what the story means. I don't know about you, I'd immediately close the book. All good narrative has a problem of exploring the unforeseen, and the novelist's art is to shape the process which leads people to investigate more and more, make that exploration. And the designer's art, I think, is akin. I'd like to conclude this talk not as a regret over the declining state of planning, but making a connection between the systematics of the open city, that is, its incomplete form, its privileging of the edge over the center, and its narrative of it's literally its narrative of development in which we don't know what comes next. I'd like to connect this at the end to what we think of as democratic space. When a city operates as an open system, incorporating principles of porosity, narrative, indeterminacy, and incomplete form, it becomes democratic not in a legal sense, but as a physical experience. In the past, thinking about democracy focused on issues of formal governance. Today, it should focus on citizenship as a means of physical participation. Participation is an issue which has everything to do with the physical city rather than with government, as I've said. For instance, even in the ancient polis, the Athenians put the semi-circular circular theater to political use. And this architectural form provided acoustics and a clear view of speakers and debates, and more, it made possible the perception of other people's responses during them. We need the equivalent of that kind of agora, which makes people physically manifest to each other. In modern times, we have no similar model of democratic space, certainly no clear imagination of an urban democratic space which is physical rather than on your cell phone. John Locke defined democracy in terms of a body of laws which could be practiced anywhere. Democracy, in the eyes of Thomas Jefferson, was inimical to cities. He thought the spaces it acquired could no longer be no larger than a village, that people had to be face to face. And it's a view which has persisted. We need a different notion of physical presence of people because today's city is filled with migrants and ethnic diversities. It's a city in which people belong to many different kinds of communities at the same time through their work, families, consumption habits, and leisure pursuits. For cities like London and New York, and this is increasingly true of cities like Johannesburg, which are becoming global in scale, the problem of citizenship, participation, is how people can feel connected to strangers, to people they cannot necessarily know. That means creating a form of urban democracy which transcends community. And you knew this was coming, you know, if you know my work. I'm going to give you an example of this. A good example of how you can transcend community, which is small, face-to-face, Jeffersonian, occurs in the corridor between St. Paul's Cathedral and the Tate Modern Gallery, which is just across the river from it. It's spanned by this, now by the Millennium Bridge. Though highly defined, the corridor is not a closed form. Along both the north bank of the Thames, both sides of the north and south of the Thames, it's generating regeneration of lateral buildings unrelated to the purposes of this design, which is creating the two. It's creating more T's of the road rather than using the bridge as a highway for people. And almost immediately, without opening its confines to this corridor, it's stimulated particularly on the south side, something which is very, I don't know if you know this part of London. Just behind Tate Modern is a huge refugee community. And the building and the houses provided by Richard Rogers around it have gradually drawn this refugee community, enormous number of Africans and also Afghanistans, into the museum to use it. They go there to get a good cup of coffee. Some use it as a toilet. They even go to the art exhibits. It's created on the other, in an unexpected use. And the good thing about the way the museum is run is that that use has been welcomed rather than seen as violating what the purpose of the museum itself. The program has undergone a narrative. It's getting less and less tourists and more locals as a result. Tourists hate, you know, you're in the middle of all these Afghans, you know, what are you doing here? This is a museum. But that kind of evolution, which the porousness of the museum physical structure has made possible, has made it a more democratic space. And to me, the issue about this is how to translate communities of identity, how to make spaces which are spaces in which strangers feel a physical connection to each other. That's what urban democracy is about, and it's what I hope you can build here in Rome. Thank you very much.